Oh, they like me. They really like me. I'm so... Oh, sorry. I was practicing for my Grammy or my Emmy or my Oscar. My Oscar, that's what it was, for all these great videos that we are making. Welcome back. It's chapter 4, section 1, section 4, section 1, chapter 4, section 1. Change over time. Ladies and gentlemen, here is your bell ringer. Go ahead and look at it. And you know what to do. Answer it on edmodo.com. And here we go. Our objectives today are going to be to identify 2 kinds of evidence that show that organisms have changed over time. We're going to identify how the fossil record shows that the changes in the kinds of organisms in the environment have been occurring over time. We're going to describe one pathway through which a modern whale could have arisen from an ancient mammal, and we're going to explain how comparing organisms can provide evidence that they have ancestors in common. There you go. Before we begin, just so you guys know, I'm sure you guys are interested in this. This is evolution. I have to teach evolution, so this is what this is. There is another system out there, just so you know. The state of Tennessee told me I can tell you that there is another theory out there. It is a theory of creationism where an almighty being created everything. However, I can't teach that, so today we are teaching evolution. Differences between organisms, and we shall begin here. Ladies and gentlemen, adaptations, which is what we've been talking about all of last chapter. That's what we'll talk about again. And adaptation is something that helps an organism survive or reproduce in its environment. Whatever the adaptation is, remember we talked about the opposable thumbs, we talked about camouflage, we talked about all those different things. Those are adaptations. Adaptations help an organism survive in its particular environment. Now, some of those adaptations obviously are physical, such as the fur color, scales, long neck for the giraffes and stuff. Other adaptations are adaptations to find food, help it protect itself, help it to reproduce, those different types of things. Those are all different adaptations that that organisms have to help it survive in its given particular environment. All right. Now, when we talk about that, individual organisms that share the same characteristics that might be members of the same family, or the same species, I should say. Same species. When we talk about species, species is a group of organisms that can mate with one another to produce fertile offspring. Okay? So in other words, if the mama and the papa, they mate and they create an offspring that can then reproduce successfully and create another organism, guess what? It is a species. All right? So like the horse and the donkey, I think it is, when they mate and they reproduce and they produce a mule, that mule can't reproduce anymore. Okay, so that's kind of what we're talking about here. So when we talk about species, they have to be able to mate and reproduce, produce a fertile offspring. All right, in order for it to be a species. Now, that's just what it is. Now. Okay. Groups of individuals in the same species form a population. Now, you may have heard me talking about population in the last video or last chapter when I was talking about a population, and we were talking about genetic bottlenecks and stuff, and we were talking about the population. A population is all of the same species. All right. So when we talk about population, we're talking about all of those exact same species, all right, of animals. Now, the question is, do species change over time? And that is something that evolutionists have said, that, you know, basically we've descended from apes. All right, that apes were at one time, that's what we were as humans. At one time, we're walking around as apes. And then over time, you know, we adapted and we changed and we became what we are today. Scientists observe that inherited characteristics of population change over time, and they think that populations change over time and new species form. Okay, so this is how they have that idea of the ape to the man type of thing. All right, and they're looking for that missing link. Now, obviously, since Earth has been here, there's been many different types of species here on planet Earth since Earth has been around. All right, and those species have all died off for one reason or another, and new species have appeared on the Earth and have taken over, and then eventually those species die off and continue on throughout the history of the world. All right. Now, how do they know that this has happened? How do they know that there was ancient species and stuff? Well, the way that they know that is because of fossils. And basically, when we talk about fossils, what we're talking about is these organisms that lived a long, long time ago. When they passed away, they died for whatever reason, natural causes, or because they were attacked and killed, or whatever happens to be. When they died, they laid down in sediment. All right. And that sediment was basically soil. The sediment is there. They lay down on top of it. And then over time, more and more sediment goes over top of it. All right. And it actually ends up burying it. Well, the pressure from all that sediment being piled on top of each other, that pressure actually compacts and actually ends up fossilizing those organisms that were inside the sediment. All right. So what are fossils? Fossils are not only the bones that we find, or the bones we find in rocks and stuff. They can actually also be footprints. They could be coprolite, which is poop. They could be all kinds of different things. That's what we consider when we talk about fossils. It isn't just a dinosaur bone. That's not all it is fossils. All right. It's the remains or imprints of once living organisms found in layers of rock. That's what exactly a fossil is. Now, the fossil record. What is that? Well, basically the fossil record is the record of all fossils, all right? So they actually go through and do radiocarbon dating and stuff like that, and they figure out, plus the estimating the ages of rocks based on the rock layers that the ages of fossils based on the rock layers that they're in. They go through and they figure out how old organisms are, and they start at the very earliest fossil and they work all the way to the most recent fossil, all right, age-wise, based on where they are in rock layers, based on radiocarbon dating, those different types of things they use to find out how old these organisms are. So they create what they call a fossil record. They have the earliest known species all the way to the most recent known species that become fossils. Obviously, we're not fossils, although some of us are old enough to be fossils. We're not fossils. But so they look at those different organisms and they can reveal how those organisms, they can discover how those organisms have changed over time. That's just by looking at that fossil record. Now, look at that fossil record. Sometimes there are some fossils that you can look at and say, oh, wow, that looks a lot like this modern species of animal. Well, then scientists then can look through at all the other fossils and say, oh, wow, look, there is a link. There is some that these fossils share some of the same characteristics, and we can see how these organisms can all be connected. Now, so looking at that, the scientists, they look and see how these organisms are connected by simply looking at the relationships between those extinct organisms and by looking at those relationships of those living organisms, seeing what they look like and those kinds of things, and say, okay, well, there is some kind of link to what these organisms look like. Now, there is an example that your book has, and it talks about the origins of the modern whale. It says, do you think the modern whales once walked? In previous lives, many years ago, not reincarnation lives, but in many years ago with different species, do you think whales walked? Well, what they've done is they've actually gone back and they've looked at many different organisms, and they've found organisms that they think resemble the modern whale, and they say, okay, well, let's take a look at this, and they're tracing from the earliest known creature all the way up to the modern whale. So here in evidence A, you look at this Pakicetus. Now this Pakicetus is a four-legged animal, has a long head. If you look at the head there of the Pakicetus, you look at the head here, the Amblyocetus, you can see that it shares some similar characteristics. You look at the chest structure. Look at the chest structure here. You can see that they do share some similar characteristics in the tail. You look at these and you say, these could be related animals. Now, this one is older. This one lived about 50 million years ago. And this one, the Amblyocetus, which they think is a descendant from the Pakicetus, lived about 49 million years ago. Okay? So these are, and this is actually, they said this was about the size of a dolphin right here. This was the size of a wolf. This was the size of a dolphin. And so they say, okay, well, look at the similarities. And yeah, they do look the same. So when they look at that, then they start looking at modern species to see if there's any characteristics, any of the same traits in these modern species. And so looking at the modern whale, if you look here, then you have the Dorudon, which is the next thing. And they said that this animal here lived in the water. All right, it could not use, it had this tiny hip bone over here, this tiny little hip bone. And it lived about 40 million years ago, the Dorudon, and it lived in the water. Well, then if you look at that Dorudon and you look at here at the modern toothed whale, you can see that the head has some of the similar characteristics. You see the chest has the same similar characteristics. And the Dorudon had this floating hip bone. Well, guess what? There's a floating hip bone right here in the modern toothed whale. So if you look back at this picture here, and then you look back at this picture over here, you can see that there are a lot of characteristics that the modern toothed whale and the Amblyscetus and the Pakicetus have. And they say, well, that means that one time this modern toothed whale walked. It could have happened. That's what they believe. Now, what they do is they compare, another thing they do is they compare skeletal structures to see if we were related to other organisms or to see how organisms were related. And if they look at the arm bones of a cat, a dolphin, and a bat, and a human, they can see that we are all kind of all related. Now, you say, well, how is that possible? Well, let's look at this skeletal structure. This is the human arm bone right here. This is what the human arm bone looks like. Well, here's the cat leg. Notice it has the same bone structure as we have. Okay, now granted, we know that cat's a lot smaller than us, but it has the same bone structure in its legs. So they're saying, well, we could be related to cats. Look at the dolphin flipper. The dolphin flipper has the same kind of arm bones, and same thing with the bat wing. And they say, wow, that these species have some kind of similar ancestor from years and years and years ago. Another thing they do is they look at DNA molecules and they see if the DNA molecules combine those together to see if there's a relationship between organisms as well. Because, looking at DNA, you can tell relationships of organisms. So that's another thing that they've been doing here recently is looking at DNA to see DNA molecules to see if there is a relationship. All right, guess what? It's review time, review time. It's time for your review. Here is your 4.1 section review. Go ahead and read and write down your notes, and I will give you a few seconds. Well, hope you enjoyed that. That is your 4.1 video. If you have any questions, make sure you come in and ask me any questions you have. But if you have any questions, you can also ask them on Edmodo, and I'll answer any questions you have. Don't be afraid to ask questions if you have them. All right, you guys have a great day, and I'll be seeing you in the future.